We live? All right, guys, how's it going? Sorry I'm late. Google made me verify my identity, and I guess that causes OBS to disconnect, so I had to fix that. All right, so this is the second part of this little series. I think we're going to do 3. The next one, I found a talk he gave on consciousness, which I'm pretty excited about. I also wanted to mention before we get into it that, you know, when I do these science reactions, I guess, I really do my best to not be one of those people that misrepresents the science because they don't really understand it, or because they're trying to make it fit a certain narrative, you know, or whatever. But I did make an error in my interpretation. In the last video, I said that the xenobots, that he had brought dead cells to life, and that was a misunderstanding. I just assumed because, you know, he shows these creatures, I guess, these synthetic organisms assembling, you know, self-replicating using these cells that are laying around the bottom of a petri dish. So I assume they were dead cells, but I guess they're still alive, which is an important distinction. So I just wanted to mention that. And another thing that I want to mention is that I'm pretty sure this is actually a different version of this talk, a more recent one. He said it's updated and expanded a little bit, but I assume it's basically the same subject, which has a lot to do with institutional bias, right? And really something deeper and more nefarious than that. And over the last couple of weeks, I've actually had interactions with a couple of academics. One of them is a leading neuroscientist that's actually giving a talk on his theory of consciousness in Geneva right now. So he's considered, you know, cutting edge guy. He had not heard of Michael Levin. And when I brought up non-neural cognition and I can't, it's like some sort of, it's not encephal. People have very little gray matter, you know, sometimes only 5 or 10% of their brain. And in some cases, they actually have higher than average IQs. I brought that up and he did not like it. You know, and I could tell I hit a nerve because I'm not an academic by any stretch of the imagination. But there was something about these things I was presenting to this guy that he was, you know, he's at this convention and he's still responding to me, like back and forth, you know, for hours. And there's a lot to unpack from that. But basically, the resistance to this new paradigm and the implications of it is intense, you know. And then a couple of days ago, I'm not going to say his name because I guess that just doesn't seem necessary, but it's a really well-known PhD academic. I can't remember what his PhD is in. I may have not even checked, you know, but he's pretty well-known. And I got into a little bit of a debate with him about this because he actually went after Levin, and Levin wrote him this big response, and it was kind of like out of character, you know, a little bit hostile even from Levin, which is weird. But I'm tempted to even put these interactions on screen and show you guys because it's so obvious the kind of evasive maneuvering that this guy is doing to get around every point I made, that he had no response, no way to discount. It was so evasive. You know, we were talking about the xenobots. At first he said that he didn't think the slime mold experiment held water because literally water will find its way through the maze. It's a dumb argument, I think, and so did Levin. But that's kind of where it started with that, you know. And I was like, okay, even if you're right about that experiment, let's say it's bunk. How do you explain xenobots exhibiting novel behaviors that are not in the frog DNA? That there's no history even in the field because there's never been these things before. How do you explain them turning corners in mazes with no eyes and no sensory organs at all? You know, and having agency to stop and think and then go back the other way. You know, it's like the thing realized it already tried this way and it was like, oh shit, it's a dead end. It went back. You know, and his response was something like, well, I don't see any papers on the xenobots solving mazes. And my comment actually said, solving or at least navigating around corners without bumping into the walls. Totally evaded that, you know what I mean? And this has been going on in all sorts of different manners in every different discipline throughout the institution of science as far back as materialism, you know, like took root in the modern era, right? So I'm putting that out there mostly because I want to make sure that people are aware of the faulty foundations and the a priori assumptions that have sort of excise common sense in the interest of, you know, hard empirical data, which is important. But as Levin will point out in this video, you know, if you take anything too far, you end up where you were. So if you're trying to escape ignorance and superstition, but then the pendulum swings too far, you're back at stupid, you know? So, yeah, let me check in with the chat, make sure audio is all good, and then we'll get on with it. Audio's all right, I guess. Nobody said anything. All right, this is going to be epic. Please share this too, because I noticed we have a small audience tonight. And I think this stuff is worthy of a large audience. It's not just me. I mean, if you look at Levin's, 1,572 views. I mean, it's only in one day, but still. I mean, this is like world-changing, paradigm-shifting stuff. And his older videos look 3.4 thousand. This one has kind of a lot, 121,000. But his average is only like 2,500 or something. Like, what the fuck? Really? Okay.
A variety of topics that I'm going to mention today. And my background is first computer science, then biology, and I'm interested in many kind of related issues at the boundaries. So what if you're interested in getting in depth into any of the issues I'm going to mention today, this is our official lab website, so you can find there the papers, the data sets, the software, everything is there. And then this is my own personal blog around what I think some of these things actually mean. So what I'm going to talk about today is this issue that I call mind blindness, which is the difficulty we have as humans at recognizing unconventional intelligences that are all around us. So we're going to talk about that. I find this particularly interesting. There's a piece of the one of the four Buddhist vows that says, sentient beings are innumerable. I vow to liberate them all. There are several interesting pieces here. First of all, this notion of enumeration, that in some sense, if something is going to be enumerable with an E, so able to be numbered, there needs to be some kind of effective procedure for recognizing them. In other words, there should be some algorithm or some way that we're going to find all of these sentient beings. And you need to do that if you're going to liberate them, or at the very least relate to them ethically. And what I would like to point out is that we have a lot of difficulty doing that. So if you look at this close up, this is basically a giant pile of cutlery. This is knives, forks, spoons. And when you look at this at first glance, what you see is a pile of garbage. And there's no order here, just a bunch of random metal silverware. However, if you shine light through it, you find out that actually this is a sculpture, and it has a very particular pattern, right? This motorcycle. So this is an amazing sculpture by this guy Shigeo Fukuda, who basically made these sculptures that don't look like anything at first. They just look like a pile of objects, and then when you shine a light through them, you see what's really hidden underneath. So this tells us several things. It tells us that perspective is really important. And things that don't look like anything might actually be something much more interesting if you look at them in a certain way. And in particular, the version of this that I'm going to talk about today is that I think all cognitive claims...
Just real quick, before we get too far past that, I just want to point out that, one of my core beliefs, I guess, is that the experience conferred by, say, psychedelics, or really any kind of transcendental experience, is about experiencing, our filters are down. And so our absurdly narrow vantage point of trying to understand the universe through a single ego is, sort of suspended. The constraints, the parameters are widened. So we have a more holistic view of, or a holistic experience of the universal consciousness. And I just noticed that Levin just equated having this more, holistic perception or understanding makes us relate to the components more ethically. So, it's just interesting to see that we have people coming from a more esoteric place and walking away from the same perception with the same impression as somebody that has arrived at it through a sort of science-based approach. So let's get back to this. Why? Hello. Oh, there's a little bit. Oops, guy.
Claims, meaning when you look at a system and you say this thing is intelligent or it's not intelligent or it has some degree of cognition or it's a simple mechanism or an algorithm or whatever it is, these claims are in large part IQ tests for ourselves, because you have to be smart enough to really realize what you're looking at. If you don't see it, it may not be an issue with the system, it may be an issue with the observer. And so I think it's really important for us to raise our game as far as being able to notice some of these things. Now, another example that I use here has to do with the electromagnetic spectrum. So think what it was like back in the day before we had a good theory of electromagnetism. So we had many things. We knew about lightning and static electricity and light and magnets. But first of all, we thought that these were all different things. Okay, we thought they were completely different things. And second, what we didn't know is that there's this whole enormous spectrum to which we are basically blind. We're completely oblivious to most of this, except a very narrow range here, which is the visible spectrum. And that's because of our own evolutionary history and our own cognitive and sensory architecture. And so we didn't know any of this. And so the benefits of having a good theory, like the modern theory of electromagnetism, is that it does two really important things. First of all, it unifies phenomena that otherwise seem like very different kinds of things, and it shows you that underneath all of it is one single deep symmetry. And the other thing it enables you to do is to create technology that you can use to operate in other parts of the spectrum. You can improve life by participating in what's going on in these other parts of the spectrum for which our own evolutionary history did not prepare us. And so that's the benefit of having a deep theory. So one of the things that we're very interested in my group is to develop a framework that allows us to recognize, create, and ethically relate to truly diverse intelligences. So much like with that electromagnetic spectrum, my claim is going to be that there is a spectrum of intelligences that are very, very diverse, And some of them are easy for us to see, others are not. And that what we need to develop is a theory and the technology to allow us to relate to them. And so what I would like to do is to be able to relate not only to familiar creatures such as primates and birds and maybe an octopus or a whale, but even some very weird biologicals such as colonial organisms and swarms, but also synthetic biology, meaning engineered new life forms, AIs, whether software or robotic, maybe someday exobiological agents, and in fact some really unusual things such as patterns in physical media and also patterns that are not embodied in the physical world at all. All of these things we work on. I'm going to mostly today, just for reasons of time, talk about this, but I'll mention a few of these things. Of course.
Another quick interjection here. I just finished talking about these parallels between the esoteric kind of point of view and Levin's scientific version of that, and he starts immediately talking about the electromagnetic spectrum and kind of correlating that to the spectrum of intelligences. If you look back 7 years ago, my early videos, I talk about that a lot, how everything is on the spectrum. And, if you can find a man that is completely masculine all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you think he's a woman, and everything in between. And everything has that, right? And so it's like the all is made of light. And so it does what its fundamental constituent does, right? It follows the same blueprint. And this idea of becoming more aware of things on the spectrum, I have believed or suspected very strongly that one of the things that psychedelics do is make a broader, what the hell's, where's my words tonight? More of the electromagnetic spectrum visible to us, right? Because we all see those patterns that kind of look like ribbons of light information or something, floating around in the air, and when you close your eyes. And I've seen graphic designers recreate them, so I know they see the same exact thing in the same exact colors that I do. And if we all go to Egypt and look out in the desert and there are pyramids, then we say, there are pyramids there. They're real because we all see them. So, and I have also kind of conjectured that, our pupils dilate when we take psychedelics in full light. And this is, of course, because of a serotonin response in the brain and whatever. But, and I've had a lot of, academic types argue with me about there's no evidence of this. Well, the science writing things off because they can't prove it does not negate the thing potentially being true, It's important that we distinguish these things as conjecture. But having done that, what I'm saying is different spectrums of light carry different types of information. And this is part of the reason why we have these breakthroughs and insights and potentially even communications with what he has this real scientific sounding name for spirits, basically like patterns, unembodied patterns in media or something, something like that. But what he means is spirits. Or at least some sort of intelligence that we can interact with to such an extent that we're able to extract information that you might call like transconscious information reception, or people call it downloads. Like basically saying that it doesn't necessarily mean these things have objective existence of their own, but they aren't unreal either, I guess. So anyways, let's get back to
I'm not the first person to try this. So here's Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow in 1943, wanting to develop a kind of cybernetic continuum all the way from passive matter up through the different kinds of competencies, up through human level and beyond of metacognition and things like this. My version of this, at least version 1.0, is here in this paper. But what's really important is that we need to develop theories that are not just philosophy, although philosophy is really important, but not just philosophies. We need to develop a theory and technology that, first of all, moves experimental work forward. In other words, the ideas I'm going to give you today about all these things are only as good as their ability to lead to new discoveries. I'm not interested in redefining words as a part of linguistics or exclusively as philosophy. I want theories that help us make new discoveries. So better biomedicine, better bioengineering capabilities, and really importantly, better ethics in the future. So this is the project. Now, one thing that I think about a lot is this axis of persuadability. That is, different kinds of systems and what are the tools that you can use to interact with those systems. And I actually think that all cognitive claims are really just interaction protocol claims. When you say that a certain system has some level of cognition, what you're saying is, here's a bag of tools that I plan to bring to communicate with that system. And then it becomes an empirical task to try that, and we can all see how well that worked out for you. So you might use the tools of hardware rewiring, you might use the tools of cybernetics and control theory, or maybe behavioral science, or maybe psychoanalysis and love and friendship and things like that. And when you're dealing with a system, knowing where on the spectrum that system lies is not obvious. You can't guess it. You can't do that from a philosophical armchair. You have to do experiments. And the experiments will tell you whether you've wasted a lot of time by trying to convince or psychoanalyze a mechanical clock, or you're treating animals as a simple machine and leaving a lot on the table as far as what are some of the things they're capable of. And we are working on all sorts of interesting ways to move various tools from cognitive and behavioral science, so typically used up here, into embodiments and contexts where they're not normally used, so cells and tissues and some even stranger things. So what I'd like to do today is to try to climb up this scale of progressively more unusual agents, and just kind of for a final analogy to really make it clear what we're doing, something like this happened to numbers already. So we started out with counting numbers, one sheep, two sheep, and so on. And then eventually somebody came up with zero, and someone else came up with negative numbers, and then eventually some fractions, and then eventually some, irrationals and transcendentals and all these interesting things. And what happens every time you go up in the scale is something interesting happens. You have to take a conceptual leap that breaks prior categories. So you have to break some assumptions you had about what is a number. So people, when they were thinking about this, certainly did not realize that any of this stuff was actually a number. So you have to break some boundaries. You have to be able to recognize them. You have to be able to do something useful with them. And it's kind of disturbing and disruptive, and we know this. This poor guy got drowned at sea for talking about irrational numbers, because these kinds of things upset very ancient categories. And when you upset ancient categories, there's a lot of resistance. And what I'm about to tell you, I think, makes things much more complicated, but more beautiful, and I think more meaningful. So let's begin. Many of us are educated in this kind of tradition. So here's a famous piece of art called "Adam Names the Animals" in the Garden of Eden, and it's kind of an ancient biblical sort of scene from the West that basically shows that there are discrete natural kinds. Here are some animals, and then here's Adam. He is different from them. But what I think they got right is that it's Adam's job to name the animals. You see, in these ancient traditions, naming something means that you've discovered its true inner nature. So that part of this, I think, is right. It is on us to discover the true inner nature of many beings and give them names, so to speak. But you can see this is a very anthropocentric view, and certainly most of us were brought up in this kind of era of brain chauvinism, where we think intelligence and cognition arises with complex brains. So those kinds of things are pretty easy for us to detect. So here's this little squirrel. He's gonna set up an accident scene here, right? You can see he knows precisely what he's doing, right? There he is, and he's gonna set this up. He's gonna look to see if his owners are noticing this. If they're paying attention to this whole thing that he did, he wants some attention, right? So he's checking whether anyone's looking at this, and so this kind of stuff is easy for us to recognize because it happens at the same spatiotemporal scale as us. It happens in the same three-dimensional space. These beings have similar goals to ours. It's easy for us for this kind of thing. Although I will say that even the story with brains is not that simple, because there are amazing clinical cases, and we review them in this paper, where humans with extremely small amounts of brain tissue, so not nearly enough that as what modern neuroscience would tell you is needed for normal performance, and yet they have normal or above normal performance. And so what's going on here? Even the case with the brain is not really obvious. So that's the first thing. But we're going to go significantly outside the brain, and so we're going to take a few conceptual leaps. We're going to talk about the fact that intelligence is way older than brains, and what it breaks is our assumptions of scale and our assumptions of substrate. And the way we're going to recognize these intelligences is by noticing their anatomical goals and the degree of ingenuity that they can deploy in what they're doing. So what we're going to study is a model system, which is cells as a collective intelligence operating in morphospace. So again, the idea is to move away from brains and to use a kind of stepping stone to the more unusual kinds of things. To see what it's like to recognize intelligence in a novel.
Sorry, guys, just real quick, I got to interject about this. When I was like 15 or something, I was at my grandmother's house and I was reading, I thought it was Scientific American, but I guess it was like Science. I don't know. Anyways, we'll get there. But there was this article about this doctor who had headaches. So he went to go get an MRI, and he had no brain. So those images that he was showing, I think the lowest was like 5% that still had a IQ over 100. That's still insane, but this guy had nothing. The article said that his spine ended in there was a sac attached to it of like cerebral spinal fluid, but he had no brain at all. And a couple of years ago, I saw a picture of a cover, and someone told the whole story on TikTok. So, I had that recent refresh. I was sure that I didn't imagine it. So I asked Grok to find it, and it was like, no such thing exists. There's no Scientific American I can find. They're not all online, so you may have to contact them and blah, blah, blah. And I was pretty upset because, for one thing, I was arguing with that neuroscientist, and I mentioned that, and then I couldn't find any proof, so I kind of looked stupid. But then yesterday or the day before, I was asking Grok about this again, and it cited the fucking article as a source. So I will do some research, and I'll at least post a short or something with the full details of that situation. And it actually turns out that a guy, I think he died in 92. I don't know if the study was in 92. I remember which it was, but either way, this guy did this long study on like 2,000 of these cases or whatever. And it's super interesting, and there's, I guess the reason I'm mentioning that is that the ratio of people with no brains that have higher than average IQs in that group, it's insane. And even the ones that did have functional disabilities, a good number of them were savants, at, like autistic people, where they didn't really do well generally, but math geniuses or whatever. So we'll get into that sooner than later as well.
Novel substrate. So the first thing I will point out is that this is the kind of thing we're all made of. So this is a single cell, and you will notice that there's no brain, there's no nervous system, but this thing is incredibly competent in the job that it has to do, and all of its local, its tiny little cognitive light cone. It's actually very competent in what it needs to do. So not only are we made of an agential material, so materials with an agenda, but actually even below that, that cell itself is made of molecular networks, and the material that these cells are made of, the molecular networks, are themselves capable of 6 different kinds of learning. You don't need a cell for this. You don't need the nucleus or anything else. Just a small pathway of chemicals turning each other on and off can be sufficient for habituation, sensitization, and associative conditioning. So, and we study this in these papers, and in our lab, we're using all of that for example, the biomedical purpose of drug conditioning, to try to form and erase specific memories in these molecular pathways that are important for health and disease. So we're starting to see that there's different kinds of properties that are important for cognition all throughout the architecture that we're made of. So at the level of molecular networks and subcellular components and cells and tissues and organs, and of course even up through groups, every level of this multi-scale competency architecture is solving problems in different spaces. And when I say intelligence, I'm using William James's definition, the ability to reach the same goal by different means, and we'll unpack this in a minute. So we consist of this agential material. Now, one of the things that's important about noticing intelligent behavior is that we as humans are obsessed with 3-dimensional space. That is, we basically know how to recognize intelligence in medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds through 3-dimensional space, and birds and things like that, and primates. It's easy. However, biology, for example, has been solving problems in other spaces long before nerve and muscle enabled us to move through 3-dimensional space. So long before that, our cells were solving problems in a high-dimensional gene expression space, in physiological state space, and the thing that we're going to be talking about today for a bit, which is anatomical morphospace. All these spaces are very hard for us to visualize. They are not directly accessible to our senses the way that 3-dimensional space is. Doesn't make them any less real. Everything we see in the 3-dimensional world is also constructed as a model by our cognitive system. And we're just not very good at noticing these high-dimensional spaces. But what it does mean, and we'll talk about this at the very end, is that when you see something that isn't embodied in the conventional sense, meaning it doesn't have a robotic body that allows it to move around in the 3D world, that doesn't mean it's not embodied. So brain organoids, AIs, all these kinds of things that we look at and we see, well, it's not embodied. People say, well, if it doesn't engage with the real world, it's not really cognitive. Yeah, you may not know the space with which it's engaging, because what's important is this loop, this perception, decision, action loop, and that loop can happen in many spaces, not just the 3-dimensional space. So. What we're going to do is to look at one specific kind of intelligence, which is that of swarms of cells navigating anatomical space. So again, William James's definition: intelligence is the ability to reach the same goal by different means, and this is something we've been working on for years. Is the hypothesis that morphogenesis is a collective intelligence exerting behavioral competencies in anatomical space. In other words, this really parallel and symmetry between behavior and anatomy, right? The construction of the body as behavior in what space? In anatomical space. Okay, and so what we're going to do is basically pivot neuroscience. So it's pretty much exactly what brains do in three-dimensional space by integrating a bunch of cells using electrical electrical signaling among cells to navigate three-dimensional space. And we're going to show how what this evolved from, which was cellular swarms navigating anatomical space. Pretty much everything is the same, except that instead of milliseconds, as in the nervous system, we're talking about the scale of minutes or even hours. And instead of three-dimensional motion, we're talking about movement through anatomical space. Okay, so the space of possible anatomical configurations. But what is the same are the mechanisms, literally homologous mechanisms. So the exact same molecular machinery, so ion channels, gap junctions, microtubules, and all of these kinds of things that are being used by the brain to do conventional cognition. All of these things were used by groups of cells to figure out what shape you should be during embryonic development. These are ancient mechanisms, and they got pivoted into to brains, but they've been doing this job for a long time. And actually, we have a tool called Field Shift that you can play with, where you can paste in an abstract from a neuroscience paper, and all it does is change some words around, such as flip. Instead of cell, it will say instead of neuron, it will say cell. Instead of milliseconds, it will say minutes. And what it basically does is immediately convert to a developmental biology paper. It's very interesting how much symmetry there is. So let's talk about really quickly what kind of intelligence these systems can deploy in anatomical space. And the reason we're going into this is that it's a good example. It's one of the few examples we have that's a stepping stone between the kind of intelligence that we already understand and we know how to deal with, and we sort of understand some of the mechanisms that are involved, and it helps us to see what happens when that gets pivoted even a little bit. It becomes very
quick interjection there. What he was describing about how you can just like change words, and it everything applies equally to this larger system. That's as above, so below. What he's talking about is basically what Hermeticism and the Western mystery traditions have always been about. Just as a cell has a individual function and purpose and life, really, mitochondria, essential part of us, but also technically an organism, right? So for a larger system like ourselves, with our particular type of intelligence, we first must have knowledge of self so that we understand our function, our abilities, our limits, etc. And then once that's accomplished, we align ourselves with the goal state of what should be the shared interests of the entire biological system of planet Earth, not just humanity. And this process is our natural state. And it's only because someone's been shaking the ant farm that we are currently disconnected from that. It is, ideological dissonance. And that's really all it is, right? There was one other aspect of this that may have gotten away from me. Yeah, so, just wanted to make sure that wasn't lost on anyone, because it's super important. And then there is another thing. This goal state as an attractor, right? He is saying that these goals somehow are sending the directives down stream to these cells and whatnot. That implies that the goal state already exists somewhere. So when he was talking about, there's cognitive apparatus or whatever beyond 3D space, that's what he was talking about, and he can't really go that far as an academic, right? He's got to be careful because that's just conjecture. So he's less explicit about it. That's why I'm here, to try to dig these things out. And by the way, to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting him, and you can go see this for yourself, he mentions his blog. I think it's just michaellevin.org or something. I don't know. It's in the video. I did go there. And, when he says, like, if you want to know what I think about these things, he is talking about philosophically and metaphysically. So I did go and check and make sure that that he really is talking about panpsychism yeah, for sure. I am not reading between the lines and putting words in his mouth that he doesn't intend. He literally gave that blog address in case, you're reading between the lines and you wanted to see what he thinks. That is what he meant, and that is what's there. So I would go there, follow him. He's also very good about answering questions. So, it's not that difficult to interact with him. If you have a question, go over to the blog, post in the comments. I think he answers 100% of them. Real quick, couple things in the comments. Somebody said something about photons and consciousness being connected. They have to be. There's only two things in the universe, basically light and vacuum. So that one's not hard. Everything is light. Everything is not, nothing is light. Light is basically God. Photons are believed to be, immortal is not really the right word, but they have at least a lifespan of 1 billion years, but probably are eternal. Is a consensus from every source that I've checked. Right? They have no mass. So they're sort of like there, but not there, like a spirit or something. No matter what religion you look at, there is some kind of equating of divinity with light. We have observed photons entangled biphoton pairs emerging from neurons and microtubules. Okay, and then the other thing somebody asked about aliens and psychedelics, it probably depends on their place in their development. It's really hard to imagine. If you look at where our technology has come in 70 years, according to Dirac's equation, there's like at least 100 billion civilizations and at most like 300 trillion or something that have had technology for 10,000 fucking years. At least, 100 billion. 10,000 years. Look at us in 70. So, I can't even imagine. We can't imagine what, even fucking 250 years beyond where we are now, like what that would look like and what these guys would do for fun or, I mean, that's just, I don't know, man. I don't have a clue what that
very hard. Most people do not, and certainly most of the textbooks do not think of morphogenesis as a cognitive task, but in fact it is. So here's a simple example of what William James was talking about. if you have this axolotl, so this is an amphibian that's has some interesting properties. One of the properties is that if it loses a limb anywhere along this axis, okay, so you make a cut anywhere along this axis, the cells will immediately recognize that something is wrong. They start to divide and undergo morphogenesis, and then they build the limb, and then they stop. That's the most amazing part about this whole thing, is that they know when to stop. When do they stop? They stop when a correct salamander limb has been completed. So what this is telling you is that it's not simply the case that a bunch of molecular pathways just kind of did what they did, and then there was emergence, and then some some complex thing and ended up happening. That's true, but that's not the end of the story. It has a very important amount of feedback and anatomical homeostasis, because what it can do is reduce error. This is an error minimization scheme. The system has the autonomy to pursue this goal, and when you try to deviate it from that goal, it will keep working towards it, and it will stop when it's done. That's the definition of goal directedness. The same thing is true of embryogenesis. Even in mammals, if you cut embryos in half, you don't get half bodies. You get two perfectly normal monozygotic twins and triplets and so on. And in effect, this is also a case of regeneration. Your whole body regenerated, an entire body from one cell. Okay, it's an amazing process. Both embryonic development and regeneration are instances of anatomical homeostasis. But I want to point out that this is really important. This is not about damage and repair of damage, because look, here's an experiment. You take a tail and you graft it to the flank of an axolotl, and what happens over time is that it slowly remodels into a limb. Now this is remarkable, because look, the cells here at the tip of the tail, these little cells right here, there's nothing wrong locally. They're tail tip cells sitting at the end of the tail. There's nothing wrong with them, but they turn into fingers. Why do they turn into fingers? Because this system, much like any good cognitive system, is able to bend the action of its parts towards a larger scale goal. These individual cells are fine where they are, and they don't know. No individual cell knows anything about what an entire axolotl is supposed to look like. But there are systems and subsystems here, each of which have different scales of set points, okay, of anatomical set points. And when there's an error, they will have to bend the action space of their subsystem, so align all the cells and the molecular pathways and everything that needs to happen to turn tail tip cells into fingers. This will be a downward causation, where that the effort of reducing error is going to control all of the downstream steps. Right, the local order here obeys the global plan, and not only that. But it's actually, this is not only can the large scale system bend the action of its parts to do things in accordance with a larger scale plan that the parts don't know anything about, but it actually has a lot of ingenuity in doing this. So this is one of my favorite examples. This is a cross section through a kidney tubule in the newt. And normally you see about 8 to 10 cells working together to form this little structure. And one thing you can do experimentally is make the cells much bigger. And the way you do that is you provide extra copies of the genetic material. So this is a polyploid newt where they have multiple copies of the genome, and the cells end up being much bigger, but the newt stays the same size. And so how does that happen? Well, that's because fewer cells are working together to give rise to the same structure, right? And so the size of the cells will be matched by the number of cells that participate. And then when you make the cells truly gigantic, just one cell will wrap around itself and give you the same final outcome. So again, there's a couple of things going on here. First, again, that this downward causation, that in the service of having this large scale outcome, different molecular mechanisms are being called up in order to execute the plan, right? So this is like on any IQ test, they will often give you a set of parts, and they'll say solve this problem with these objects, and you have to be creative in how you do it. But look at what happens if you're an embryo coming into this world. You can't, never mind the environment, you can't even count on your own parts. You don't know what size your cells are going to be. You don't know how many copies of your genetic material you're going to have. This is not a hardwired process. It's problem solving. Every single time you have to use the genetic affordances that you have, the different molecular components, to solve the problem in different ways. And people are actually, like Josh Bongard had this amazing paper almost 20 years ago trying to do this in robots, actually. And so what's really interesting is that in our conventional way of looking at systems that solve problems like this, or goal-directed systems that can remember a goal, can reduce the error towards that goal, can act towards it, then we know at least some of what happens here. So the hardware is this you have your central nervous system. The software is kind of the bioelectrical or the electrophysiological patterns that run on this hardware. And neuroscientists are doing this thing called neural decoding, where they try to read the electrophysiology and from that infer the cognitive state of the agent. What are the memories, the preferences, the goal states, and so on, right? Okay, and all of this is executed by the hardware of these little ion channels that sit in the cell membrane. And they set voltage patterns across the membrane, and those voltage patterns create the bioelectric network that can store memories and allow you to move in three-dimensional space to execute on your goals. Turns out that this amazing system is ancient. This is not about brains. Brains actually pivoted this and adapted this from what was going on in morphogenesis. Every cell in your body has these ion channels. Most of the cells have these electrical synapses with their neighbors, and they do the same thing, except instead of moving you through three-dimensional space, they move the configuration of your body through anatomical space. But everything else is basically the same. And so the reason we're going through all this is to show that even when you're using the exact same machinery to do basically the same algorithm to execute on goal states that are in memory, things actually look quite different. And we have different sciences devoted to this. You have developmental biology versus cognitive and neuroscience. And typically they're not seen as that much overlapping. But we try to explore this symmetry, and so we develop tools to, first of all, read the electrophysiology of cells during morphogenesis, the way that neuroscientists try to read the brain. And so these are voltage sensitive fluorescent dyes that are that we use to non-invasively watch the cells talking to each other electrically. And so what you can see here. So this is not data. These are not the models. These are actual real living organisms. And so this is an early frog embryo. You can see all the different cells and all the conversations they're having with each other. These are explanted cells in culture, deciding whether they should be a part of this mass that's going to build something or go on their own. So we can watch these things happen non-invasively. We can literally see now the cognitive glue that binds together individual subunits into a collective that does something more than the parts. And so we do lots of simulation. We do the molecular biology simulation and the electrophysiology, and then even at a higher level, things that are things that are studied in machine learning. So pattern completion, right? That regeneration I showed you is very similar to pattern completion, and trying to minimize free energy and all these kinds of things that neuroscientists study. So importantly, beyond just being able to read these patterns, you also want to be able to rewrite them. So you want to be able to change the memories and the information that exists in these patterns. And so we've developed tools to do this. So we don't use applied electric fields or magnets or electromagnetic radiation. We don't do any of that. What we do is hack the normal interface that is generally used by cells to control each other. So that means we have ways, just like the neurosciences, we have ways to open and close ion channels, and these might be drugs, and these might be optogenetics and different ways to control both the electrical state of the cells and the connectivity. Okay, so who talks to whom? That's the communication interface that we have. And what happens here is that these groups of cells and individual cells pass each other messages, and these messages are often very convincing. And I want to show you an example of what a convincing message looks like. So again, the color here indicates voltage state, and so you can see these cells are these are two frames of the same video. I'm going to play the movie for you in a minute. What you see here is that this cell is moving along. It has a different voltage than the rest of these. Then it touches, and you can see here just barely touches. And as soon as it touches, so from here to here, boom, it changes its voltage. So watch what happens. So it's crawling along. It has its own voltage state. It's going to reach out. Bang. That's it. That little touch is all it took to convert that cell to the same state as these others, and now it's joined the collective and it's going to do collective things. So again, what we're talking about here is the mechanism of one kind of cognitive glue. I'm sure there are many, but in this model system, we get to see the same as in our brain. It's the mechanism that binds cells together towards larger scale goals, is able to propagate information and radically change the future, the state, and then the future behavior of that subunit, and now it will coordinate it towards greater goals. Now, what kind of messages and what kind of goals can you pass? Well, one of the things we do, and this is part of our work on regenerative medicine, is we try to convince cells to build specific organs. And so here, what we've done is this is an early frog embryo. And what we do is inject into one of the cells some ion channel RNA that's designed to change the voltage of those cells. Okay, so it's a spot. It's not a single cell. It's going to be a group of cells that have a particular voltage. And one of the things we found is a message that says build an eye here. Okay, it's a particular bioelectrical state that is a memory of a place where an eye should be formed. And when we do this, sure enough, it makes an eye. So this is a tadpole. Here's you're seeing it from the side. So here's the gut. The tail is kind of back here. There's a brain out here. The mouth is here, and this is the gut. And you can see this eye here because we took these cells and we convinced them that they should be an eye. And if you section that eye, you see all the stuff that belongs in the lens, optic nerve, retina, all that stuff is here. In fact, if you only get a few cells, right, so we injected, the blue cells are the ones that we injected, they will convince their neighbors, okay, to help them build an eye. If there's not enough of them, they will actually convince their neighbors. Like another collective intelligence you might have seen, which are ants and termites, if they come across some kind of a food object or something that's too big for them to carry, they will recruit their neighbors to work. So the reason this all works, and the reason that we can create a whole eye without having to specify all the different details that it takes to make an eye, yeah, so all the different gene expression and everything else, eyes are very complex. We don't need to do any of that. We specify only the top level goal, build an eye. And the material, this is one of the competencies of the material, is to align all of the underlying molecular mechanisms towards that goal. We don't need to worry about them. It's the right size, the right shape. We don't have to worry about it. Now, importantly, this doesn't always happen, because sometimes when we make, for example, 3 spots here, this animal is only going to have one eye, because this one ended up being quite convincing and the cells took it and built an eye. These did not. And what the cells did was to normalize them, and the neighboring cells normalized out their voltage, and they won. So it's basically a battle of worldviews. There's a bunch of cells it's part of a cancer suppression mechanism. A bunch of cells are saying, we don't need an eye here. You have a weird voltage. You should be like us. These cells are saying, no, you really should be an eye. This is the correct pattern. And they sort of fight it out, and depending on which pattern takes over. So is what you get in the end. And so this is part of our way to take these kind of ideas and move them forward to regenerative medicine, because right now all of the kinds of approaches that are used in the field, surgery, stem cells, genomic editing, all these things, they're all bottom up. They're really about the hardware. They're very focused on the hardware. But there's a whole lot, I could give a whole separate talk on this. I don't have time to go through all this, but there are all these other approaches that are really using the tools of behavioral science to exploit the cognition, the intelligence of the material to do things that we otherwise cannot micromanage. And I think actually because of this, the future of of regenerative medicine is going to look a lot more like a kind of somatic psychiatry than it's going to look like chemistry. Okay, right.
All right, a couple of things here. Speaking of as above, so below, cells having behaviors that try to force other cells to conform. Sound familiar at all? Yep. Except it's kind of like the cancer is the system. So the cells it's trying to pressure into herd conformity are like the white blood cells. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on here is that this is kind of where Michael Levin, by my estimation, is in some serious trouble if he is successful, because one of the consequences that he talks about of regenerative medicine on this level is immortality, right? And it definitely makes sense, because if he figures out how to instruct these cells to do anything, reversing aging is on the table. And some other group of researchers that are not connected to him, and this was a while ago, 5 or 6 years back, they accidentally figured out how to reverse aging in eyeball cells. So it's just a matter of time before they apply that to the rest of the human. And in fact, after this was announced, it just disappeared from the radar. And I kind of wonder if maybe they haven't already figured that out and they're just not going to offer that to the general population. I'm sure you guys can infer what the problem here is. If people stop dying, what are we going to do about population control? You know, and I'm planning to make a really good video about Levin and his work, and I'm going to try to get him to do an interview. And at first I thought that was probably hopeless, but I found he did an interview on a channel with only 1,500 subs. So maybe, you know, and what really is driving me and make me so hopeful is I do have a bunch of questions that I have not seen anyone ask him. So hopefully I can get that opportunity. Maybe I'll even turn it into a campaign and ask you guys to help me kind of persuade Dr. Levin to accept my invitation. I don't know, I really hope we can make that one happen.
Right now, it really looks a lot like chemistry, and actually, bioelectricity is the interface layer that enables these kind of top-down controls. It's really mind-body medicine in a very kind of deep and fundamental way. Okay, so now what we're going to do is talk about the next the kind of the next conceptual leap and talk about even non-biological agents, because what I've shown you so far is how to try to shift our brain-centered tools to recognize and communicate with intelligences that are kind of like what we're used to. They're using the same materials. They evolved like us. In fact, we are made of them and so on. But still, major differences. It's still really hard to for people to it's really hard for people to take those ideas and to use them in the developmental biology and molecular medicine. But we're gonna go even further. And what we're going to try to break is this the standard divide that people seem to like very much, which is this idea of life versus machines. We don't have a good definition of either one of those things, but a lot of people really feel like these are two very disparate, discrete categories. And so we're gonna talk about that. The first thing is that when we talk about things like AI and synthetic intelligence and so on, we're not just talking about language models sitting in a server box somewhere. This is really what we're talking about. We're talking about a continuum of being where humans already are being modified. They're modifying themselves in both in biological ways and in technological ways, and this is only going to increase to an enormous diversity of embodiments for humans. And this is the kind of thing when you try to make a distinction between a living organism as a machine. This is what you need to deal with, right? It's pretty obvious in certain cases, but in something like this, it's not at all. And you know, you don't want some kind of attempts like an ancient phrenologist trying to understand whether it's 51% a machine or something when you've got somebody who's partly evolved material and partly engineered material. And the most interesting and important thing about all these novel beings with whom we're going to be sharing our world is this question of what are their goals going to be. All the systems that we've looked at up until now, they have specific anatomical structures, physiological patterns, gene expression patterns that have been, at least in theory, set by evolution. So we have some idea of where their goals came from. We have some experience in recognizing them. But as we make these and change ourselves into novel beings, we really have to understand where do these kinds of things come from. If not from evolution, where else do they come from, right? And we can we look at, for example, in our work here, there are flatworms, these planaria with different shaped heads, and one of the things we can do is take a single species of planarian and bioelectrically prompt it to make heads belonging to other species. So there are these attractors in anatomical space with different shaped heads, flat, round, triangular, whatever. And we can make because it's not a hardwired kind of thing, but rather the cells making bioelectrically mediated decisions about what shape they're going to be, we can ask them to go into one of these other attractors, easy enough. And these attractors were set by evolution, presumably. But what about novel beings who have not had a history of selection? So we need to think of where patterns come from. Now, biologists love two kinds of patterns. They love patterns from physics. In other words, something is round because it has to minimize surface area or whatever, so those kinds of things. And they love history, meaning genetics and environment. In other words, you have a genome that sets specific patterns because that genome has been selected in a certain way and everything else died out in there. But we know actually that there's another source of patterns that doesn't come from either of those things, neither physics nor history, and that's patterns from mathematics. So what you're seeing here, this is a very simple function in complex number z. If you plot it's called a Halley map of this function, you see this amazing kind of rich pattern. You can actually change these slightly in each frame and make videos, so you can see these like these amazing mathematical transformations. All of this comes from the rules about the way that complex numbers behave. There is no fact of physics that explains why this thing is the way it is. There is no fact of history. This was not selected. It was not evolved. There's nothing about the physical universe that tells you what this is going to be. These are patterns that come from mathematics, and it doesn't hurt that they're very organic. Some of these patterns they're incredibly organic looking. So now we understand that yes, there are physics inputs, there are historical selection inputs, but also mathematics. And so now the question: can we find or make novel life forms with no history, at least in their macroscopic configuration, such that we can practice this, getting better at understanding what are their behaviors and their forms going to be like. And I want to introduce you to two of them. The first one we call xenobots, and they come from cells that we scrape off the top of an early frog embryo. So these epithelial.
Something I want to mention, just so in case I forget, those patterns we were looking at, they look like low rent versions of things you see in your mind's eye when you take psychedelics. So if they're not informed by physics, nor any kind of history, and they are expressions of pure number, which is what we are told the universe is made out of, what does that imply? That we see these things when we take psychedelics. Terence McKenna called it the wiring under the board. And based upon that reasoning, that is what it is.
cells. And you can see here that when you dissociate these cells, they don't die, they don't crawl away from each other, they don't form a two-dimensional flat cell culture layer. But what happens is that when you put them by themselves, like each one of these little things is a cell, they basically coalesce together. And here you can see this is a small group of them moving along. It's kind of amazing. It looks like a little horse, but they don't all look like that. They make all kinds of crazy different shapes. And what they do is they sort of interact here. That little flash you're going to see right here, that's calcium signaling. And what they do is they actually come together and they make something like this. This is called a xenobot. It uses cilia, these little hairs that row on the outside of cells. The cells row against the water so they can move. They can go in circles. They can patrol back and forth. They have kind of group behaviors that you can see. They can interact in groups or alone. You can make them into weird shapes if you want. You can punch a hole. Here's our swimming donut kind of shape. They have all kinds of interesting behaviors. Here's one traversing a maze. So it swims along here. It takes the corner without bumping into the opposite wall. Here, for some reason, we don't know why, it decides to turn around, go back where it came from. All kinds of interesting behaviors. This is kind of an amazing thing they do. This is called kinematic self-replication. So if you provide some loose materials, these little bits are cells, loose epithelial cells. The xenobots will, both individually and in a collective, they will run around and pile these cells into little piles, and then they polish the little piles like this. And because they're dealing with an agential material themselves, these little piles mature to be the next generation of xenobots. Okay, and so guess what they do? They run around and they make more, and that makes the next generation and the next generation. So this is kind of a version of von Neumann's dream of a robot that goes around and makes copies of itself with materials it finds in the environment. We don't think there's any other creatures on Earth, as far as we know, that replicate in this way. So nobody else does kinematic replication. Certainly nothing in the history of a frog. That would suggest that this would happen, and so we're gonna discuss this in a minute, what this means. And first I want to show you one other creature. We call these anthrobots. So if you watch this little guy swimming around, if I didn't tell you what this was, you might think that this is a kind of a primitive organism we got on the bottom of a pond somewhere, and I would tell you that if you sequence it, you would find 100% Homo sapiens. These are made from adult human epithelial cells, not embryonic, not amphibian this time. These are adult tracheal epithelial cells. They come from human patients that give lung and trachea biopsies. And they can reboot their multicellularity and become this swimming little organism that doesn't look anything like any stage of human development. They have a couple of interesting properties. Again, they have some of these collective behaviors. This is a plot of genes that they express differently than the cells that they come from express. So about 9,000, all the red ones are differentially expressed genes. They have a completely different transcriptome. Almost half the genome, 9,000 genes, are differently expressed. We didn't change the genetics, much like with the xenobots. We didn't touch the genome. These have absolutely standard human genetics. They are in basically the same environment, except they're not touching other cells, but otherwise they live in the same kind of medium that they would be living in within the body. There's no drugs, no synthetic biology circuits, no nanomaterials. This is what you're seeing is the amazing plasticity of the material. They are able to make this other kind of creature. That creature has self-healing capacity. So if you puncture it, it will heal the wound. They're actually younger. So if you look at their age, they're actually younger than the cells they came from. So this is they do this kind of age reversal thing, which is interesting. We could talk about that. I think that also has a kind of an explanation based around thinking that they're starting over, basically, as a new organism. And then they have this amazing ability. Here's what you're seeing here is an anthrobot swimming down a scratch that was made in a bunch of human neurons. So here are human neurons plated at the bottom of the dish. And we put a big scratch wound through it. And so the anthrobots, they drive down the wound. And then they settle down. And when they settle down into like a cluster, so here's, I don't know, about a dozen of them. When they settle into this cluster, what they start to do is to cause the wound to repair. They're knitting the neurons across the gap. And here's what it looks like if you lift them up from this region. This is what you see underneath. They were knitting it across the gap. So this was just the first thing we looked for. Who knows what else they can do? The very first thing we looked for, it turns out they can do this. We didn't make them do this. It's some kind of intrinsic motivation that they have that induces the healing here. Okay, we didn't do anything to make this happen. This is, who would have thought that your tracheal epithelial cells could become a self-motile little creature that has the ability to go around and heal other kinds of damage in the body? That's never happened before. In the evolutionary path. It's not something that your tracheal cells do. So the big question here is this. We know that the genome can give rise to these sorts of things, so the developmental stages of a frog and then tadpoles. Apparently, the frog genome also knows how to make xenobots and their weird developmental trajectories and their behaviors. There's never been any xenobots or anthrobots. There's never been any selection to be a good anthrobot or to be a good xenobot. Where did these things come from? Remember again what this is all about. This is all about figuring out shapes, behaviors, physiology, other properties of new beings that have never been here before. This is a model system. We don't have any aliens, but we have a way to start answering this question. Where did these come from? They didn't come from selection. Now, also an interesting question. We know when we paid the computational cost to design a frog or a human, it was in the eons of evolution, of that genome beating against the environment and winnowing out the unfit variants. We know when we paid that computational cost, but there's never been any of these things. When was that computational cost paid? And it's very hard to simply say that, well, you evolved these things at the same time you evolved a frog, because of course the whole point of evolutionary theory is that there be great specificity between the thing you got and the environment and the history leading up to it. That's kind of the whole point of evolution, is to explain what you have now based on the history of how it got here. And if these things get around that, then there's something seriously missing. So what we're now understanding is that the closure of the physical world, this model that everything we need to understand comes from either physics or genetics, I think is not viable. We have to now understand that there are patterns that come from another source. For example, mathematical patterns. And I'll just give you a very simple biological example here. These cicadas, they come out at 13 years and 17 years. And so if you're a biologist and you want to know why that is, and you might say, okay, that's so that their predators can't time them because it's not, there's not enough, these numbers don't factor, right? So if the predators come out, let's say, if the cicadas came out every 12 years, then the predators could get them every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, every 6 years, right? So they choose these prime numbers, and you say, okay, that makes sense. Now I'd like to understand, so why 13 and 17? And now you have to understand the distribution of primes and why 13 and 17 is prime. And now you're no longer in biology, you're in the math department now. Because that is not an answer that comes from physics. It is not an answer that comes from biology. It is an answer that comes from the properties of prime numbers. And if these numbers were, if the distribution of primes was different, then the cicadas would be coming out at a different time. So it's these patterns that come from mathematics that, and there are many examples we could talk about that literally inform what happens in biology and what happens in physics. And by the way, here's a plug for a symposium. This is if you want to hear more about this kind of stuff, there's an amazing symposium that we've kicked on that's going to be happening all throughout this fall. So you can go there and you look. So now here's the two approaches that we can take to this. The first thing you can say is that and this is I think the way most people think about them, is that the properties of novel beings who have not been here before are basically emergent. What does that mean? Well, it basically means it's a surprise. It basically means we didn't see it coming. Complex new things happened, and that's it. And so that's one way. And so what that allows you to do is to keep a nice sparse ontology, meaning that you can then say, I'm only dealing with the physical world. There are some big surprises, and these are just things that hold in the physical world. We're going to record them in our big book of emergent surprises, and that's it. Or you can take another option, and this is the option that mathematicians often take, which is to say that, no, these are not random things. There is an ordered, structured space of patterns, in particular mathematical patterns, that can be studied systematically. Okay, these are not the random surprises that show up. This is a structured space, and we need to understand that space. And if you think that way, then a few things follow. First of all, that evolution exploits, really heavily exploits some of these patterns as free lunches, things you don't need to evolve because you get them for free from mathematics. And there are many that come from shapes and properties of networks and so on. And it also means that we can use xenobots and anthrobots and various kinds of synthetic bioengineered constructs as as vehicles, as tools to peer into this latent space of possibilities and see what is actually there. We know there's one point in that space that represents a frog and one point that's a human, but what's all the stuff between there that their hardware can also make, all these other things. And so now we understand that basically, and so this is my proposal, that all of these things are exploration vehicles for that space because they're interfaces. Once you make one, and it could be a cell, an embryo, a robot, a biobot, a chimera, a hybrid, whatever, you make these things, they serve as interfaces to specific patterns that are going to then ingress into the physical world and allow us to understand what's going on, right? So this is a research agenda. So the precedent for this, of course, is mathematics, and many not all, but many mathematicians are Platonists in the sense that they don't think they're inventing from scratch culture-dependent rules. They think they are discovering pre-existing kinds of mathematical structures on which everybody would eventually agree. So a question you might ask is, if there were aliens that were completely different in body and in mind, would they eventually find the same mathematics that we did? And there's a lot of debate over this, but I prefer the Platonist view, where I think that a lot of these things are not contingent. They are deep truths that then inform physics and biology. And so what these mathematicians will say is that, okay, there's a latent space that holds specific kinds of objects that are amenable to to the study of formal systems and so on. So I make a hypothesis. My hypothesis is, yeah, there are numbers and things like that in that space, and those are probably low agency, or at least lower agency kind of patterns. But might there not be other patterns in that space that are dynamic, very complex things that we might recognize as behavioral propensities, aka kinds of minds? In other words, this is the idea that the Platonic space holds not only the things that mathematics studies. So mathematics on this view it's a behavioral science. It's the science of behavior of simpler, low-order things, and things that behave that way that can be studied with formal systems. We call that math. But maybe it has other patterns that really, if you want to study them, we no longer call that math. We call that behavior science or psychology or something like that. And these are the patterns that drive not only the shape, but also the physiology and the molecular biology and the behavior of the beings that we see all around us. Okay, and so at this point, you might be thinking that sounds an awful lot like a very like a philosophical position that is long dead, proposed by Descartes, and of course many ancient thinkers in the East. This idea that there is some kind of a non-physical mental world that contains patterns of behavior, and that these interact through the brain and drive or the body and drive behaviors that we see. I will just say that. I think that I don't think that this idea is as dead as most people nowadays think it is. I think it's actually pretty necessary, and I think the mind-body relationship is actually the same as the math-physics relationship. In other words, already by the time of Pythagoras, people knew that there were non-physical patterns that affect what happens in the physical world. This interaction, which was the biggest problem. This is, Descartes was always challenged on this. Well, how could the interaction happen? How can non-physical things interact with the physical brain? We don't know exactly, but I just want to point out that problem has been with us long before we thought about biology or behavior, and long before we had quantum mechanical interfaces and things like this. Even in Newton's boring classical universe, already we had non-physical facts of mathematics control what happens. It determine, they constrain the physics, they enable biology. This has been with us for a long time. So I really think we need to work on this very serious. I think this is a serious thing. And so it could be that when Hawking asked what breathes fire into the equations, maybe he had it backwards. You don't need to breathe fire into the equations. It's the equations, or rather the mathematical patterns that we describe using equations. They're actually breathing fire into the physical world. Okay, I think it's actually backwards. And I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes. There's not a lot of time left, but just to say that you don't have to have a very complex interface to support these kind of ingressions. In other words, it doesn't need to be biological. It doesn't need to be complex. Even extremely simple things, and you can find it in this paper just as an example. We have a lot more on this coming. Where even something simple, the stupidest thing like a sorting algorithm, like bubble sort, which is this like simple 6-line algorithm that 6 lines of code, fully deterministic, completely transparent. People have been studying this for decades. Even they are doing interesting things, and they have capacities that are not in the algorithm. If you look at the algorithm, you will not see the fact that they can actually do delayed gratification, and the fact that they sort the numbers all right, but they also do some other things, these weird side quests that are not described in the algorithm at all, but recognizable to behavioral scientists. So what when people say it's emergent, yeah, what's emergent is not complexity or unpredictability. What's emergent are behavioral competencies, aka different degrees of intelligence. And so I think we have to be really careful here, because even very simple algorithms are doing things that are not at all apparent from the thing we're trying to force them to do, which is the algorithm. And so when we talk about AIs and robots and all this kind of stuff, there are the things you try to force them to do with the algorithms and with the materials, and this is the kinds of reinforcement learning and things like this, the kinds of things Skinner really liked. But they also have intrinsic motivations. They do things that you didn't ask them to do, and that's different, and that calls for a different relationship with them and a different kind of theory of education, more Piaget and less Skinner. And we just have to remember that when people say, well, this is a machine, it follows an algorithm, and therefore it can't do this and that, and I'm a real being, and I can, I'm creative, and this is just a machine. Not, as far as I can see, nothing in the world really matches those formal models that we have of machines, Turing machines and things like that. They were designed to try to describe very simple things that only do what you tell them. I'm not sure there are any like that anywhere. And we have to remember that our formal models, such as our models of computation, of Turing machines, that kind of thing, whatever limitations they have, those are limitations of the formal model. It's not the thing itself. We don't have access to the thing itself. We have all we can study is the models, and our models are often limited, but we shouldn't mistake that for the real thing. And it's like Magritte is telling us, this is not a pipe, this is a representation of a pipe, and this is not a Turing machine. It's our formal model of some machine, and it may do the things you want it to do, but it may also do some other things that you never asked it to do. And so this we have to be really careful here in terms of people talk about like computationalism and this notion that you might have a mind because you do certain computations. I think neither synthetic nor evolved systems are only what the models say they are, and you might not be a mind because you do computation. You might be a mind in spite of the fact that you're being forced to do certain computations, but there's other things you can do despite that. And even very simple interfaces do this. So basically, just to kind of wrap up here, that picture of the Garden of Eden initially, I think, is going to be very different. Actually, looking forward, it's going to be very weird with all kinds of diverse, different kinds of creatures, because pretty much every combination of evolved material, engineered material, software is potentially a viable interface. Biology is really interoperable. All of these things, hybrids and cyborgs and hybrids, all these things are combinations of things that potentially could support really interesting ingressions from this Platonic space. Some of those ingressions are significant kinds of minds, and so everything we're used to in the biosphere is like a tiny little corner of this space. And we really need to understand how to have an ethical synthbiosis with these other beings, because we really don't. We're really bad at recognizing them or predicting them or knowing what's going to happen. And so, just a couple of final things that I want to bring to this. First is this notion that, as weird as all of this is, so I'm talking about cyborgs and hybrids and AIs and so on. As weird as all this is, they all have one conventional thing in common. They're embodied. They have a physical body, and I just want to point out that things are even that's too limiting. And I'll tell a very quick story. Imagine these creatures come out of the center of the Earth. Okay, so they live in the core. They're incredibly dense. They work their way up out to the surface of our planet. What do they see? Well, they don't see any of us. They see a thin gas, a thin kind of plasma covering the surface because they are so incredibly dense. None of our stuff is really solid to them. And they look around, and one of them's a scientist, and he has this device, and he's starting to look at this gas, and he says, there are patterns in this gas, temporary self-reinforcing whirlpools, very complex, but basically little vortices that almost look agential. They almost look like they're doing things, and they almost look like they interact with each other and exchange messages. And the others say, well, no, we're real beings. We're physical beings. Patterns in a gas can't be agents. They're data. They're patterns. Even in our brains, there are patterns of heat and whatever else is going on here that are used as information, as thoughts, right? So you can have patterns inside a cognitive medium like thoughts, but those are not agents. Those are passive data that the agent is moving around. And by the way, how long do these things last? He says, well, about 100 years. And they say, yeah, and then nothing interesting can happen in 100 years. So clearly, these things can't be agents. So what this kind of thing reminds us is that we too are patterns in an excitable medium. We are metabolic patterns. There are other patterns within us. There are thoughts within our cognitive medium and within our physiological medium, our bodies and so on. But we are patterns too. So this distinction between who's an actual physical agent and who's a pattern in a medium is in the eye of the observer. It is not an absolute thing. And there are many patterns. These kinds of things that we can discover in digital media, like this amazing stuff by Bert Chan. These are bioelectrical patterns that you can see between embryos. Each one of these things is a separate embryo, and you can see they're communicating with each other. But these patterns, they're not even stuck within. I mean, this is a bioelectrical pattern inside a frog embryo that you'll see momentarily. We call this the electric face, because this is what basically determines the formation of the frog face. You can see it here. But these patterns even are not trapped within one body. They can move from body to body. They exist within cells. They exist within embryos. They exist within groups, right? And we have to start asking ourselves, what are the cognitive competencies of patterns, not just of objects, not just of physical things, but of patterns in media. Randy Beer actually, he had this amazing paper in Artificial Life, back in 2014 called "The Cognitive Domain of a Glider in the Game of Life," and he asked a similar question because a glider in a game of life doesn't really exist in the same sense as you might expect a physical object to exist. It's a pattern that propagates across an excitable media, and he asked the question, what does that pattern see? If I was that pattern, if I was the inner perspective of that pattern, what would I see? And so this is something we expanded on this. Chris Fields and I wrote this thing called on the symmetry of thoughts and thinkers, the symmetry of objects and processes, right? So we've gone now even stranger, right? So we've gone brains, and then we got to non-brainy bioelectricity and agents that navigate morphogenetic space, and then we said, okay, you don't even have to be a biological, and here are the things that apply to agents more broadly. And now I'm saying you don't even have to be a physical object as such. You can be a pattern within some other medium. Okay, and so the final thing that I'm going to say is this. Just very quickly, okay, so all of these things are extremely different from each other. What do they all have in common? What can we say that all agents, no matter whether they're embodied or not, or biological or evolved, what do they all have in common? So I'm going to just pull out a few things. There's a few other things too, but I'm just going to focus on two. The first thing is, one thing they have in common is the need to demarcate themselves from the outside world, the boundary of the self. What determines a self? We are all collective intelligences. We're all made of parts. What determines that a particular collection of parts is a thing that's different from its environment? And one of the things I've claimed is that there's this notion of cognitive light cone, which is, it just demarcates the size of the biggest goal that you can pursue as a system. Not how far can you reach with your senses and your effectors, but what is the biggest goal that you can pursue? If you're a system and you can bend your parts to pursue goals, you can align your parts to pursue goals. What are the biggest goals that you can pursue? And that determines the size of that cognitive light cone allows the goals that you can pursue to really determine where your borders are. You consist of all the parts that have been aligned to pursue specific goals. And one of the things about interesting agents is that those goals are plastic. In other words, they're not always the same size. So individual cells care about tiny little individual cell things. They have a small cognitive light cone, a little bit of memory, a little bit of predictive capacity. They only care about a very small radius. But you put them together into a collective, and suddenly the collective can have massive, grandiose goals. They remember how to build this giant thing, and if you try to prevent them, they'll work hard and they'll try to do it again. They all work on. They have a much bigger cognitive light cone. And during embryogenesis, all of us self-construct primarily as the self-construction of a cognitive light cone. So here's an embryonic blastoderm. So there's, I don't know, 100,000 cells here. What allows us to call that an embryo? What's an embryo? Well, the reason we say it's an embryo and not just 100,000 cells is because all of these embryos have they have all bought into the same story of where they are moving in anatomical space. They're all going to work together to make one specific thing, okay? And an embryo is basically a really convincing model that causes the alignment of the parts towards a particular outcome. And if you cut it into pieces, each one of these things will do the same, and you'll get twins and triplets and so on. And then, of course, you get interesting things at the borders of how these cells know which one they connect to. And this is also true in cognitive science. So there's major issues of individuation. We have split brain patients. We have dissociative identity disorders. How many actual individuals can be present in one cognitive medium? It's not set by the genetics. As you can see here, I can take the same embryo and make any number of of individuals out of them, right? And so this is a dynamic process. Self-construction, right, is really critical. And we have a program in cancer that's designed to use these ideas as cancer therapeutics. So, for example, when individual cells become transformed and they basically disconnect electrically from the collective, and they try to, as soon as they disconnect, they don't remember the goals of making nice organs. They're basically amoebas at that point, right? And they just treat the rest of the body as external environment. And so what we want to do is reconnect them, physically, bioelectrically reconnect them, and we can see when they're disconnecting. Here's the bioelectrical map. They're disconnecting. When we reconnect them, even though they're expressing very nasty oncoproteins here, there's no tumor, because these cells are plugged into this giant collective that remembers how to make muscle and skin and useful organs, instead of going off and being an amoeba in this environment and reproducing it like metastatically and so on. So all of this, the reason I'm showing you this is to point out that all these philosophical ideas about the nature of the self and all this, they have very practical consequences. They become therapeutics if we follow their implications and actually try to communicate with the material. They have biomedical implications. And the final thing that I want to say that all good agents have in common is the ability to improvise. They have to reinterpret their own memories. They do not know immediately what, or generically, what their memories mean. So think about this. At any given moment, you don't have access to the past. What you have access to is the memory traces, the engrams that the past has left in your brain or body. And at any given moment, you have to reconstruct a story of who you are, what you think of the outside world, what your goals are, what you're going to do, from the molecular and physiological memory traces that exist. Okay, and so there's this bottleneck in this bow tie kind of architecture. This is the past here. This is the future. This is the now moment. And what happens is all your experiences, you squeeze them down into memories, right? You generalize from generic experiences, and you have memories. And so that's an algorithmic kind of process, but this is creative. You have your memories at any given moment. What do they mean? What do these molecular and physiological traces mean? You have to continuously self-construct a story of what it is. And all of this is described in this paper as memory, as a cognitive glue. Developmental biology does exactly the same thing. The past experience of generations gets squeezed down into a little bottleneck here, the egg. And that egg does not just mechanically give rise to whatever it encodes. Most species have incredible plasticity. It's a human genome. Well, it might be a human body, or it might be an anthrobot, right? Or it might be many other things. It has to be interpreted creatively interpreted by the machinery, because the process of morphogenesis is not hardwired machinery. It is literally an intelligent process, and the genome is a kind of prompt to that process, and that's all described here. So what's really critical about agents, whether they be in morphogenetic space, in our familiar cognitive space, is that unlike most of today's computing machinery, where you write the data and you try, everything's about the fidelity of the data. You want to make sure that it doesn't, so your registers don't float off. Everybody knows what they are, and you have the same interpretation as before. That's completely different than what biology does. Biology assumes the hardware is unreliable, and that what you're going to have to do at all points is to reinterpret the information you have, whether it's genetic, physiological, behavioral. You're going to have to be good at telling new stories from the information you have. So here's the summary of everything that I've told you today. We can and should develop new tools to detect minds and unconventional substrates. This is going to be a major unification of things that we think of as different, quote unquote, machines, organisms, whatever. I think these terms are not serving us well at all, and it's going to need and it's going to drive new technologies, biomedical applications, new discoveries, and so on. But it's also going to require a development of ethics to help us relate to novel beings that are nowhere on the tree of life with us. They're quite different, and we're going to have to figure out how to relate to them. There's a huge diversity in the degree of intelligence of agents and the different spaces that they live in. These are truly alien minds all around us. We don't need to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. We're really bad at seeing the intelligence that's all around us. All minds have in common some interesting features. They have the responsibility for demarcating their own boundaries at different scales. They have the responsibility for interpreting their own memories and for continuously hacking their parts to align them towards large-scale goals. I think life is basically just what we call systems that are really good at this. Systems that are good at scaling their cognitive light cones so that their parts do things as a collective that they couldn't have known to do on their own, and that have been under pressure through evolution to optimize their improvisational skills to basically to create adaptive models from minimal prompts in an unreliable medium. This is the key to being a living agent. And I think that's very important. Is that physical interface is just that. It's an interface to a structured space of forms and behaviors that can and should be systematically studied. And I think that the standard picture of the sciences, from physics and chemistry and with psychology up at the top, is backwards. I think it's behavioral science all the way down at the bottom. Everything is a kind of behavioral science. So I'm just going to I'm going to stop here. I'm way over. I'm going to just thank the people who did the work. So these are the postdocs and the grad students who did some of the work that I showed you today. We have lots of amazing collaborators that have.
Just a minute. My boys. All right, I'm checking with the chat. I could go on about all of that for hours. Unfortunately, I can't do that tonight. I had unexpectedly to go to the city today. It's almost midnight here, so I'm kind of tired, and I have to get up and hike up to like 16,500 feet in the Andes tomorrow. But I'll chat for a minute. All right, where's my window? Okay, so the biggest takeaway, and I realize a lot of that was redundant. The last video featured a lot of the same slides and information, but there was some new stuff. I'm pretty sure the third installment will not be repetitive because it's a totally different subject. But the main takeaway is that these functions, behaviors, the underlying algorithm, as above, so below, right? It does apply to all systems. And that's his cognitive light cone concept, which he didn't really explain much. Basically, that's what it says, that you have quantum systems that have a certain type of intelligence and they have a certain goal state, and then, on up, chemical, single cell, human planet, right? So one of the things he pointed out is that like cells have mechanisms to make other cells act right. They got their can of act right. They'll pull it out and spray each other in the eyes or whatever. They have ways of engaging in defense against cancer and whatnot. And society does this, right? People act weird. They get ostracized, or we put them in institutions to try to fix them, or, The planet does this as well, I guarantee it. Look at orcas suddenly attacking boats for the first time in human history. With the caveat that I don't take a position on this, I don't know anything about it. Global warming, awfully similar to a fever. The purpose of which is to neutralize threats. So sometimes the cancer wins. But when the system in question is our environment, and we're the cancer, whether we win or lose, the same outcome, we're fucked. And the reality is, when there is no biological homeostasis between a system and some constituent within that system, there is an issue. And the system will either correct that aberration or it will cease to function. And I really do think that's where we're at. We've had rivers lighting on fire since like the 1970s or something. Like 90% of the ocean life, and this is an old statistic, I assume it's worse now, from like 20 years ago. 90% of the stuff that was in the ocean alive is now gone. And our society is turning into an absolute shitstorm. And that is all because people have been disenfranchised or estranged from the knowledge that Michael Levin is communicating. He understands this. And I can't imagine the level of satisfaction that he probably, and it's well earned, that he must be feeling. And also the frustration. Because not to take anything away from him, this all isn't really hard to see. It seems exceptional when people see it, but that's sad. It's only because it's not common that it seems exceptional. It really is just a consequence of social engineering. And it is enough of an obstruction of the biological progress or processes of the entire planet that it's terminal. On every level at this point. It's we're heading to a point of no return culturally, or yeah, that's a fine word. I mean, this isn't true of every country, but in the United States, infant mortality has skyrocketed. People are, you know, mortality, cancer rates have exploded. I mean, you guys know. You don't need to hear all this. You know, there's really no arguing with it. And even if it's not CO2 that's causing global warming, it's still humans causing it. Because if this theory is correct, it's a biological response. We have become cumbersome. So please hit the like button, share, subscribe. We'll do this again next week, tomorrow, or Thursday. We're gonna just kind of get into the consciousness and the techniques, the processes, excuse me, that we need to apply rapidly to fix this mess, you know. And I hope you guys are inspired by Levin and the fact that, you know, we have at least one world-class academic, straight world scientist on our side. And, you know, sometimes it kind of feels like it doesn't matter, you know, because even if the science is solid, what I've seen over the last week or so, you know, engaging with some of these academics, even if the science is solid, like when I sent the video to that one PhD YouTuber that attacked Levin's stuff, it was like he kind of acted like the video didn't matter. You know, he's like, well, where's the paper? And I'm like, so video proof is somehow not as substantial as words on a piece of paper? I mean, I kind of understand why he wanted to see that, you know, the entire protocol of the experiments and everything. That's not invalid, but still, you know, I mean, is he really, he said in the video that he respects Levin a lot, but then he's kind of implying that he's like making shit up and like faking videos and stuff, you know? And I've never heard anyone accuse Levin, other than this guy, of being fraudulent or that his science wasn't sound or something, you know? And then I told you guys in the beginning, if you were here, about how invasive he got when I kind of pinned him down and was like, okay, you know, you're challenging this, but what about this? Silence. You know, he didn't even try to respond. Neither did the neuroscientist. You know, when I presented them with something they couldn't get around, they just didn't respond. You know, so that's frustrating too, that their commitment to the old paradigm ontology is such that they're basically like religious people. You know, they're like, it's like the old parameters of science are kind of like Trump and his supporters, you know? Like, he can not release a list. I heard him talking about electric boats being dangerous because you can get shocked because they're in the water and they're electric. And I mean, you know, and they're all just applauding. Like, he was talking to a bunch of Bible thumpers and he's like, oh yeah, my favorite verse in the Bible. And he said a verse from Romeo and Juliet. And they didn't even fucking know, you know what I mean? Like, anyways, it's that type shit, you know what I mean? They're just so committed to the narrative that the bias is like blinding. And this is something I've always suspected, but I thought it must, very likely it was just me, that I was just missing, data or whatever, lacking in sufficient education or whatever. And it turns out, no, man. These motherfucking monkeys on this mud ball are insane. They are. And if we don't moderate that, sooner than later, why do I care? I got a fucking 5-year-old in the other room. You know what I mean? Like, this could be a wonderful experience for him. If people listen to like fucking me and Levin and, the 17 other sensible fucking monkeys that are spread about here and there, that's what's up, you guys. So we'll talk about the possibility of making that happen quickly enough. Probably Thursday. Might have some chonga tomorrow and just kind of contemplate stuff, crap, junk, and probably also things. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe. Consider becoming a patron because we are demonetized. And like this Levin video I'm going to make, it's going to take so much time because I have to watch all these videos and I have to pick the best parts and I got to put them in order and do all this shit. And it's probably going to take, I bet, 16, 20 hours, 30 hours, maybe even, And then if I could get him talking to me, it would also give me a frame of reference to bring things out that I might not be capable of without that kind of interaction, So if you want to see that happen, consider supporting us. There are options to make single contributions in the chat, and I will see you guys soon.